Tonight, we will explore the extraordinary life and legacy of Claude Monet, one of the most beloved and influential artists in the history of painting. As you relax and unwind, you will hear 100 fascinating facts about his paintings, his garden, his obsession with light, and the remarkable dedication that carried him through more than 6 decades of extraordinary creative work. There is no need to stay awake for every detail. Simply listen, rest, and let the story of Claude Monet gently guide you towards sleep. Claude Oscar Monet was born on the 14th of November, 1840 in Paris, the second son of Claude Adolphe Monet, a grocer, and Louise Justine Aubray, in an apartment on the Rue Lafitte in the 9th arrondissement of the city. When Monet was 5 years old, his family relocated to the Norman coastal town of Saint-Adresse, near Le Havre, where his father went into partnership with his brother-in-law in a ship chandlery business that supplied goods to the fishing and merchant fleets working out of the port. The move from Paris to the Normandy coast placed the young Monet in direct and daily contact with the sea, the harbour, the changing quality of coastal light, and the particular atmosphere of a working port town that would become one of the enduring subjects of his early painting, and a formative influence on his understanding of what natural light could do to the surfaces of the world. Monet showed an early talent for drawing that expressed itself initially not in serious artistic study, but in caricature, and by the time he was a teenager, he had developed a local reputation in Le Havre for the accuracy and humor of his drawn likenesses of local figures. He sold these caricatures in a local frame shop for 10 to 20 francs each, earning enough from the practice to begin saving money with a degree of financial independence that was unusual for a boy of his age and background. The frame shop where his caricatures were displayed was also the shop where the painter Eugène Boudin sold his work, and it was through this connection that Monet first encountered Boudin, the man who would become his first serious artistic mentor, and who would introduce him to the practice of painting outdoors directly from nature that would define his entire subsequent career. Eugène Boudin, the Norman landscape painter who first encouraged Monet to paint outdoors and introduced him to the practice of working directly from the natural world rather than from studio studies, had a more lasting influence on the direction of Monet's artistic development than any other single person in his life. Boudin was a painter of beaches, harbours, and coastal skies, whose work was characterized by a freshness and atmospheric sensitivity that came directly from his practice of painting in the open air, and his encouragement of the teenage Monet to abandon caricature and engage seriously with landscape painting set the younger artist on the path that would eventually produce Impressionism. Monet later said that it was Boudin who had opened his eyes, a phrase that carries particular weight given the central role that sight and visual perception would play in his work for the rest of his life. Monet travelled to Paris in 1859 at the age of 18, against the wishes of his father who wanted him to join the family business, and entered a period of immersion in the artistic life of the city that would shape the direction of his work for the following decade. He visited the Salon, the annual official exhibition that was the primary venue for the public presentation of French art, and spent time at the Académie Suisse, an informal studio where artists could draw from live models without the structured teaching program of the official École des Beaux-Arts. It was at the Académie Suisse that he first met Camille Pissarro, one of the painters who would later become a central figure in the Impressionist movement, beginning a friendship and artistic relationship that would last for decades and that represented one of the most enduring connections of his professional life. Monet's military service in Algeria, where he was posted as a young soldier in 1861 after being conscripted into the French army, lasted only a year before he contracted typhoid fever and was sent home to recover, But the experience of the North African light and landscape left an impression on his visual sensibility that he acknowledged in later years as genuinely formative. The quality of light in Algeria, its intensity, its clarity, and the way it transformed the colors of the landscape into something more vivid and more directly experienced than anything available in the northern French light he had grown up with, gave him an early and direct experience of the relationship between geographical location, atmospheric conditions, and the appearance of the natural world that would become the central preoccupation of his mature painting. His mother paid for a substitute to complete his military service after his recovery, and he returned to Paris to resume his artistic education. The painting that is generally considered to have given the Impressionist movement its name, and through that name, its identity, was Monet's Impression, Sunrise, a small canvas depicting the harbour of Le Havre in the early morning light, shown at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. A critic writing about the exhibition used the title of the painting as the basis for a dismissive and sarcastic review, coining the term Impressionism as a way of mocking what he considered the unfinished and sketch-like quality of the work on display. The painters themselves adopted the term, initially with some irony and later with genuine pride, transforming a critical insult into the name of a movement that would become one of the most significant and most widely loved in the history of Western art. The painting itself is now held in the Musée Marmottan Monet in Paris. Monet's first significant romantic relationship was with Camille Léonie Dancieux, a young Parisian woman who became his model, his companion, and eventually the mother of his two sons, Jean and Michel, before the two were married in 1870. Camille appears in a significant number of Monet's paintings from the 1860s and early 1870s, most famously in the large canvas Woman in the Green Dress, completed in 1866, which depicts her from behind in a sweeping silk dress that Monet painted with a fluency and technical confidence that attracted considerable attention when it was shown at the Salon. She was a consistent presence in his work and his life during the years of his greatest financial difficulty, enduring poverty and social uncertainty with a steadiness that he acknowledged and depended on. And her death from cervical cancer in 1879, at the age of 32, was a loss that affected him deeply and that he recorded in one of the most unusual and most discussed paintings of his career. The painting Monet made of Camille on her deathbed in 1879, showing her pale face against white pillows, her features barely distinguishable in a blur of grey and blue and white, was not a painting he had intended to make, but one that he found himself making almost involuntarily, driven by what he later described as a compulsion to record the play of light and colour on her face, even in the moment of her death. He wrote about the experience to his friend Georges Clemenceau years later, describing how he had found himself analysing the colours of her face before he was even aware of what he was doing, and how the realisation of what he was doing had filled him with horror at his own reflexive artistic response to the most painful moment of his personal life. The account has been discussed extensively by scholars as one of the most revealing statements any artist has ever made about the relationship between perception, habit, and the sometimes uncomfortable automatism of a deeply trained visual sensibility. Monet's financial situation throughout the 1860s and 1870s was frequently desperate, and the letters he wrote during this period to friends and patrons contain repeated and increasingly urgent requests for money that document a level of material hardship that is difficult to reconcile with his later image as a prosperous and celebrated artist living in the celebrated garden of Giverny. He and Camille moved repeatedly during these years, staying in rented accommodations in Paris and Normandy that they could rarely afford, pawning personal belongings when necessary, and relying on the generosity of friends, including the painter Frédéric Bazille, who allowed Monet to live in his studio during particularly difficult periods, and who represented one of the most consistent sources of practical support during the years when Monet's work was attracting critical hostility rather than commercial interest. The first Impressionist exhibition, held in April 1874 in the Paris studio of the photographer Nadar on the Boulevard des Capucines, brought together works by Monet, Renoir, Degas, Pissarro, Sisley, Morisot, and Cézanne in a show that was intended to provide an alternative to the official salon's increasingly rigid gatekeeping of what French art should look like. The exhibition attracted considerable public attention but largely hostile critical reception, with reviewers objecting to what they described as the unfinished, sketch-like quality of the work and the apparent indifference of the painters to the technical standards that the academic tradition demanded. Monet showed 5 paintings and 7 pastels, and while none of them sold at the exhibition, the collective act of showing outside the official system established a precedent and a sense of shared identity among the group that would sustain the Impressionist project through the critical hostility of the following years. Monet's practice of painting in series, producing multiple canvases of the same subject under different conditions of light, weather, and time of day, developed gradually through the 1880s and became the defining organizational principle of his mature work from the Haystack series of 1890 onward. The series approach allowed him to pursue the investigation of light and atmosphere in a systematic way that a single canvas could not accommodate, and it reflected his conviction that any subject was in reality an infinite number of different subjects, depending on the conditions under which it was observed. The same haystack seen at dawn, at midday, in winter, in summer, in fog, and in bright sunlight was not the same subject repeatedly painted, but a series of entirely different visual experiences that happened to share a physical referent, and the series format gave him a way of making that insight visible in accumulated form. The Haystack series, which Monet worked on between 1890 and 1891, and which comprised approximately 30 canvases depicting the large grain stacks that stood in the fields near his home in Giverny, was the first of his major series, and the one that established his reputation in the United States as well as in France. When the series was exhibited at the Durand-Ruel Gallery in Paris in May 1891, all 15 canvases on show sold within days a commercial success that was entirely unprecedented in Monet's career, and that transformed his financial situation almost overnight. The American art dealer who attended the exhibition immediately purchased several works for American collectors, beginning a relationship between Monet's painting and the American market that would make him one of the most collected artists in the United States, and that would eventually result in major holdings of his work in American museums. From coast to coast, Monet moved to Giverny, the small village in Normandy where he would spend the second half of his life and create the garden that became the subject of his most celebrated work. In April 1883, initially renting the house and land before purchasing them outright in 1890, when the commercial success of the Haystack series made the purchase financially possible. He had been living in various locations in Normandy for several years before discovering Giverny from the window of a train, drawn to the particular quality of the landscape, the wide, flat fields, the river, the quality of the Norman light that he recognized immediately as a place he could work. The house he rented was a long pink farmhouse with shuttered windows and a walled garden that he transformed over the following years into one of the most famous gardens in the world, planting it with an obsessive attention to color, sequence, and seasonal effect that reflected the same visual intelligence he brought to his painting. The water garden that Monet created at Giverny, separated from the main flower garden by a road and fed by a diverted stream from the river Epte, was the result of an application to the local authorities for permission to alter the watercourse that initially met with considerable resistance from his neighbors, who feared that his exotic water plants would contaminate their water supply. He persisted with the application and eventually received permission to proceed, constructing the pond and the Japanese-inspired wooden bridge that crosses it in 1893, and beginning the plantings of water, lilies, willows, wisteria, and bamboo that would transform the water garden into the distinctive and internationally recognized landscape that his late paintings have made familiar to people who have never visited Giverny. The garden was his creation as deliberately and as carefully as any canvas he painted, and he tended it with a team of gardeners under his close personal direction for the rest of his life. Monet's relationship with the art dealer Paul Durand-Ruel, who began buying his work in 1871 during one of the most financially difficult periods of his career, was one of the most consequential dealer-artist relationships in the history of modern art, providing the financial stability and institutional support that allowed Monet to continue working through years when his paintings were attracting more critical hostility than commercial interest. Durand-Ruel invested heavily in Impressionist painting at a time when doing so was a genuine financial risk, and his commitment to Monet specifically buying paintings in bulk during difficult periods, organizing exhibitions in Paris, London, and New York, and maintaining his support through the years of critical resistance was essential to the survival of Monet's career during its most vulnerable decades. The relationship between them lasted for more than 40 years and contributed as much to the eventual triumph of Impressionism as any single painting either of them was involved with. The Rouen Cathedral series, which Monet worked on during extended visits to the city in 1892 and 1893, produced approximately 30 canvases depicting the facade of the cathedral under different conditions of light at different times of day, and it represented one of the most ambitious and technically demanding undertakings of his career. He rented rooms in buildings across the square from the cathedral and worked on multiple canvases simultaneously, moving between them as the light changed throughout the day and returning to each one when the light conditions that had initially prompted it recurred. The logistics of the project, managing dozens of canvases, tracking the precise conditions associated with each, working in rented rooms rather than his familiar studio, were enormously demanding, and Monet wrote to his companion, Alice Hochet, during the campaign, describing a state of almost constant exhaustion and self-doubt that contrasted sharply with the luminous confidence of the finished paintings. Monet's companion and eventual second wife, Alice Hochet, whom he had known since the 1870s when she and her husband Ernest had been among his patrons, became his domestic partner following Ernest's bankruptcy and eventual death, and she managed the household at Giverny with an organizational competence and personal devotion that provided the stable domestic foundation his work required. Alice brought her 6 children from her first marriage into the household, which already contained Monet's 2 sons from his marriage to Camille, creating a blended family of 8 children that Alice managed with considerable skill, while also serving as Monet's primary emotional support and his most consistent correspondent during the extended periods he spent away from. Giverny working on his series paintings. She and Monet married in 1901, 11 years after they had begun living together, and her death in 1911 was a blow from which he took several years to recover. The London paintings that Monet produced during 3 extended visits to the city between 1899 and 1901, depicting the Thames, Waterloo Bridge, Charing Cross Bridge, and the Houses of Parliament through the famous London fog, represent one of the most sustained and atmospheric bodies of work in his entire output. He was drawn to London precisely because of the fog, the thick, yellowish coal smoke and water vapor that blanketed the city during the winter months and transformed its familiar landmarks into barely visible presences emerging from and dissolving back into a luminous atmospheric haze. He worked from his rooms at the Savoy Hotel, painting the view across the river with an obsessive attention to the minute variations in the fog's density, colour, and luminosity at different times of day, and he returned to the canvases after each visit to work on them further in his Giverny studio, a process of revision that continued for several years after the last London visit. Monet's eyesight began to deteriorate seriously in the early 1900s as a result of cataracts that developed in both eyes, a condition that progressively reduced his ability to perceive colour with the accuracy and subtlety that his painting required, and that eventually left him almost entirely blind in both eyes by the late 19-teens. The effect of the cataracts on his painting has been the subject of considerable scholarly and scientific analysis, with researchers examining the changes in his colour palette during the period of deteriorating vision and comparing them to the known effects of cataracts on colour perception. The condition causes a general yellowing and dulling of perceived colours, particularly affecting the blue end of the spectrum and the increasingly warm, red, and orange tones of some of Monet's paintings from the 1910s have been attributed by some scholars to this perceptual change, though others argue that the palette changes reflect deliberate artistic choices rather than involuntary perceptual distortion. Monet underwent cataract surgery on his right eye in January 1923 at the age of 82, in an operation that was ultimately successful, but that involved a prolonged and difficult recovery, during which his vision was severely disrupted, and his ability to work was almost entirely suspended. He was given corrective lenses following the surgery that allowed him to perceive blue and violet more intensely than a person with normal vision, and the late paintings he produced after the surgery show a notably increased presence of blue tones that some scholars have attributed to this perceptual effect of the post-surgical lenses. He refused surgery on his left eye, preferring to retain some vision in that eye, even if impaired, rather than risk the disruption that a second operation might cause. And he continued to work until the final months of his life, despite the ongoing difficulties that his compromised vision created. The Grandes decorations, the monumental water lilies paintings that Monet worked on during the final decade of his life, and that now fill 2 oval rooms in the Orangerie Museum in Paris, represent the most ambitious single project of his career and one of the most extraordinary acts of artistic will in the history of modern art. He conceived the project as a gift to the French state following the end of the First World War, intending the paintings to provide a space of peace and contemplation for a nation that had endured 4 years of devastating conflict, and he worked on the canvases in his Giverny studio with a dedication that persisted through failing eyesight, the death of his son Jean, and his own declining health. The paintings were installed in the Orangerie in the year of his death, 1926, and the 2 oval rooms they occupy were designed in close collaboration with Monet himself to create the specific experience of total immersion in a painted landscape of water and light that he had envisioned. The Japanese bridge at Giverny, which Monet painted more than 50 times across several decades, and which became one of the most recognizable motifs in his entire body of work, was inspired by the Japanese woodblock prints that he collected obsessively throughout his adult life, and that covered the walls of his house at Giverny in a dense and carefully arranged display. His collection of Japanese prints, which numbered in the hundreds and included works by Hiroshige, Hokusai, and Utamaro among many others, was one of the largest and most carefully assembled private collections of ukiyo-e prints in France, and the influence of Japanese visual aesthetics, the emphasis on asymmetry, the flattening of pictorial space, the attention to seasonal and atmospheric effects on his painting was profound and acknowledged. The bridge he built in his water garden was a direct translation of the wooden arched bridges common in Japanese garden design, and its reflection in the still surface of the pond below it became one of the subjects he returned to most persistently throughout the late period of his work. Monet's friendship with the French politician and journalist Georges Clemenceau, who would later serve as Prime Minister of France during the First World War, was one of the most significant personal relationships of the second half of his life, and one that had direct consequences for the creation and preservation of his greatest late work. The two men met in the 1870s and maintained a close friendship for the rest of their lives, visiting each other regularly, corresponding extensively, and providing each other with a quality of intellectual companionship and mutual support that both found sustaining. It was Clemenceau who persuaded Monet to donate the Water Lilies paintings to the French state, who negotiated the terms of the donation, and who ensured that the orangerie installation was completed according to Monet's specifications, an act of practical friendship that secured the survival and the public accessibility of the most important work of Monet's final years. Monet died on the 5th of December 1926 at his home in Giverny at the age of 86, and was buried in the small churchyard of the village church of Giverny, where his grave can still be visited today. He had continued working until very close to the end, and the studio at Giverny still contained unfinished canvases at the time of his death, paintings that had been in progress for years, and that he had continued to revise and rework with a persistence that his failing eyesight and Hamann, declining health, had been unable to entirely extinguish. His son Michel inherited the house and the remaining paintings, and the garden at Giverny fell into a period of neglect following Monet's death before being restored in the 1970s and opened to the public as one of the most visited cultural sites in France. The garden at Giverny as it exists today, the flower garden with its central path lined with climbing roses, the water garden with its pond and Japanese bridge, is a restoration rather than the original, having been allowed to fall into serious disrepair in the decades following Monet's death, before being rescued by a program of careful restoration begun in 1977 under the direction of the Académie des Beaux-Arts. The restoration was based on Monet's own paintings, his correspondence, the testimony of people who had known the garden during his lifetime, and historical photographs, and it represents one of the most ambitious and most successful acts of horticultural restoration ever undertaken in connection with an artist's legacy. The restored garden now receives approximately 600,000 visitors each year, making it one of the most visited sites in Normandy, and a place where the relationship between a painter's vision and the physical world he created from it can be experienced with unusual directness. Monet's painting Luncheon on the Grass, begun in 1865 as an enormously ambitious, large-scale work intended to challenge the dominance of Edouard Manet's controversial painting of the same subject shown at the Salon des Refusés 2 years earlier, was never completed and survives today only in fragments and a smaller preparatory study. The original canvas measured approximately 4 meters by 6 meters, a scale more associated with history painting than with the outdoor leisure scene Monet was depicting, and the ambition of the project exceeded what he was able to execute within the time available before the Salon submission deadline. He rolled the canvas and stored it in a cellar where it was damaged by moisture, and when he retrieved it years later, he cut it into sections, 2 of which survive and are now held in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. The painting represents one of the most significant might-have-beens of his early career, a work whose ambition is still visible in its fragment. Monet's relationship with Edouard Manet, whose name was so frequently confused with his own that the mix-up became a running source of amusement and occasional frustration between them, was one of the most important artistic friendships of the Impressionist period, combining genuine mutual admiration with the productive tension of two very different painterly temperaments, engaging seriously with related problems. Monet was older, more socially established, and more directly engaged with the Parisian art world's institutions and controversies than Monet, who was primarily interested in escaping the city and working in the open air. But the two men shared a conviction that painting needed to engage directly with the visual experience of contemporary life rather than retreating into historical or mythological subjects, and their conversations and mutual observation of each other's work contributed to the development of both. Manet's death in 1883 affected Monet genuinely and marked the end of a relationship that had been one of the more sustaining connections of his middle years. The painting, Women in the Garden, completed in 1866 and now held in the Musée d'Orsay, was made entirely outdoors. Monet dug a trench in the garden to lower the canvas so that he could reach the upper portions without a ladder, while maintaining the natural light conditions he required, and it was rejected by the Kamar. Salon jury the following year on the grounds that it appeared unfinished. The rejection was a significant blow, both financially and professionally, and it contributed to the accumulating sense among Monet and his circle that the Salon system was fundamentally unsuited to evaluating work that was attempting something genuinely different from the academic tradition the jury was trained to assess. The painting's rejection was eventually purchased by Frederic Bazille, who paid for it in monthly installments that provided Monet with a small but regular income during one of the most financially precarious periods of his early career. Monet's series of paintings depicting the cliffs at Étretat on the Normandy coast, produced during several visits to the area in the 1880s, represent some of the most formally beautiful and compositionally adventurous landscapes of his middle period, finding in the dramatic rock formations, the sea caves, and the needle of rock rising from the water a set of natural forms that his serial approach to a subject could explore with particular richness. The cliffs at Étretat had been painted by other artists before Monet, including Eugène Delacroix and Gustave Courbet, but Monet's approach, working in all weathers and at different times of day, seeking the specific quality of light that transformed the chalk cliffs from simple landscape features into luminous presences, produced a body of work that went beyond anything his predecessors had achieved with the same subject. The paintings were well received when shown and helped to establish his reputation as a landscape painter of exceptional sensitivity and ambition during a period when the wider Impressionist project was still attracting considerable critical resistance. Monet's trip to the Mediterranean coast in 1883, made in the company of Auguste Renoir, produced a group of paintings of the landscape around Bordighera on the Italian Riviera that surprised even his closest associates with the intensity and brilliance of their color, a response to the southern light that seemed almost excessive to eyes accustomed to the cooler tones of his Norman paintings. He returned to Bordighera alone the following year for an extended campaign that produced approximately 50 canvases of the lemon trees, olive groves, and blue Mediterranean light that he found simultaneously thrilling and technically demanding to paint. He wrote to Alice during this campaign that the motifs were so beautiful and the light so extraordinary that he despaired of ever being able to capture what he was seeing, a familiar expression of the self-doubt that accompanied even his most successful working periods, and that he appears to have found simultaneously tormenting and productive. The Belle Île campaign of 1886, during which Monet spent several months painting the dramatic granite coast of the island off the southern coast of Brittany in some of the most challenging weather conditions he had ever worked in, produced a group of paintings that many scholars consider among the most powerful and emotionally intense of his entire career. The island's coast, all dark, jagged rock, churning sea, and dramatic skies was entirely different from the landscapes he had been working in, and the paintings he made there have a quality of raw elemental force that is absent from the more lyrical Normandy and Mediterranean work. He worked through storms and heavy rain, describing in his letters to Alice the physical difficulty of maintaining his position in high winds while trying to paint the precise effect he was after, and the resulting canvases show a painter engaging with the natural world on terms that the natural world itself was setting rather than the painter. Monet's painting of the poppy fields near Argenteuil, completed in 1873, and now one of the most reproduced works in his entire output, shows his companion Alice, then still Alice Hochetet, and his son Jean walking through a field of red poppies toward the viewer, with a second pair of figures visible higher on the slope behind them, in a composition that captures a quality of ordinary summer afternoon happiness with a lightness and directness that makes it one of the most immediately appealing paintings of the Impressionist period. The painting is notable for the way Monet uses the red of the poppies as a rhythmic element in the composition, leading the eye from the foreground figures toward the background in a way that gives the flat Norman landscape a sense of depth and movement that purely descriptive painting could not achieve. It is a painting that looks simple and is in fact carefully and deliberately organized, and the gap between its apparent spontaneity and its actual compositional intelligence is characteristic of the best work of his middle years. Monet's campaign in Venice in the autumn of 1908, undertaken with Alice despite her already declining health, produced a group of paintings of the Grand Canal, the Palazzo da Mula, and the Doge's Palace that are among the most atmospherically seductive works of his late career, capturing the quality of Venetian light on water with the accumulated sensitivity of decades of looking at similar problems in different contexts. He had resisted going to Venice for years, fearing that the city was so thoroughly associated with the great painters of the past, Titian, Tintoretto, Veronese, that working there would feel presumptuous. But the experience of painting the Venetian light was so compelling that he immediately regretted not having come earlier and wished he could return to continue the work. He continued to revise the Venice paintings in his Giverny studio for several years after the visit, and they were not exhibited until 1912, by which time Alice had died, and the paintings had taken on for him an additional quality of elegy for a journey taken together that could not be taken again. The influence of Japanese art on Monet extended beyond the visual aesthetics of the prints he collected to encompass a broader set of ideas about the relationship between art and nature, the value of sustained attention to a single subject across changing conditions, and the possibility of finding in the most ordinary natural phenomena, water, light, seasonal change subjects of inexhaustible visual richness. The Japanese concept of mono-no, aware the bittersweet awareness of the transience of things, resonates deeply with Monet's practice of painting the same subject repeatedly as light and season changed, an approach that embeds the passage of time into the act of looking and makes impermanence itself a subject of the work. He may not have known this concept by name, but the sensibility it describes was genuinely present in his approach to the natural world, and the connection between his painting and the Japanese aesthetic tradition was recognized and discussed by critics and artists in both countries during his lifetime. Monet's studio at Giverny, a large purpose-built space constructed in 1907 to accommodate the enormous canvases of the Water Lily series, was the environment in which the most ambitious work of his final years was produced, and it was here that he spent the majority of his time in the last 2 decades of his life, surrounded by the vast canvases that lined its walls, and returning to them day after day with a patience and a persistence that his declining eyesight made both more necessary and more difficult to maintain. The studio was heated in winter and lit by a large north-facing skylight that provided the even, diffuse light most suitable for assessing the color of the paintings on the walls, and Monet worked there daily when he was well enough, often through periods of ill health that might have kept a less driven man in bed. The studio was demolished after his death, and the site is now part of the garden, but the extraordinary body of work it produced can be experienced in the two oval rooms of the orangery that were designed to house it. Monet's son Jean, his first child with Camille, died in 1914 after a long illness, and the loss of his eldest son, coming 3 years after the death of Alice, created a period of personal grief and professional paralysis that temporarily halted work on the Water Lilies project and threatened to bring it to a permanent end. It was partly the intervention of Georges Clemenceau, whose friendship and practical support were as valuable during this period of personal crisis as they had been during the campaign to establish the Orangerie installation, that persuaded Monet to return to work and to channel his grief into the expanded and increasingly ambitious version of the Water Lilies project that would eventually produce the Grandes decorations. The loss of Jean and Alice in such close succession appears to have deepened rather than diminished the emotional investment he brought to the late work, giving the final paintings a quality of accumulated feeling that goes beyond the purely visual investigation of light and water that he described as his subject. The Musée Marmottan Monet in Paris, which holds the largest collection of his work in the world, including approximately 100 paintings donated by his son Michel after his death in 1966. There was not originally a museum, but a hunting lodge that was converted into a private mansion in the 19th century and bequeathed to the Académie des Beaux-Arts in 1932. The museum's holdings of Monet's work were significantly expanded by Michel's bequest and again by subsequent donations, and the collection now includes the Impression, Sunrise, that gave the Impressionist movement its name, a significant group of the late Water Lilies paintings, and an extensive archive of drawings, letters, and photographs that provides one of the most comprehensive records of his working life available in any single institution. The museum is located in the 16th arrondissement of Paris, in a quiet residential neighborhood that retains something of the unhurried atmosphere that the paintings themselves seem to breathe. Monet's approach to color was empirical rather than theoretical, based on looking and testing rather than on the systematic application of color theory, and he was characteristically skeptical of attempts to explain or justify his use of color in scientific or philosophical terms that went beyond the direct evidence of visual experience. He was aware of the color theories developed by writers, including Michel-Eugène Chevreul, whose work on complementary colors and simultaneous contrast was widely discussed in the artistic circles he moved through, but he insisted that what he knew about color he had learned from looking at the world rather than from reading about it, and he resisted attempts to align his practice with any theoretical framework that might constrain the freedom of his direct observation. The authority of the eye over the authority of the system was a conviction he maintained consistently throughout his career, and one that was as much a temperamental position as an artistic one. The Argenteuil period of the early 1870s, when Monet lived in the small town on the Seine outside Paris and painted the river, its sailboats, the railway bridge, and the surrounding landscape in a sustained body of work that represents some of the most joyful and technically confident painting of his career, was also the period during which the core group of Impressionist painters were in closest contact with each other and most frequently painting alongside one another. Renoir, Manet, Sisley, and Caillebotte all visited Monet at Argenteuil during these years and painted the same subjects he was painting, and the cross-fertilization of ideas and approaches that occurred during these encounters contributed to the development of Impressionism as a recognizable style with shared characteristics that went beyond the individual temperaments. of its practitioners. The paintings Monet made at Argenteuil have a quality of expansive pleasure in the act of looking and painting that gives them a distinctive character among his various series and campaigns. Monet's painting, the Gare Saint-Lazare, of which he produced a series of approximately 12 canvases in 1877, depicting the interior of the Paris train station, filled with steam, smoke, and the grey industrial light filtering through the glass roof, represented one of the boldest subject choices of his career, a deliberate decision to find the same qualities of light and atmosphere in a modern urban interior that he had been pursuing in the natural landscape. He obtained permission from the station authorities to set up his easel inside the building, reportedly presenting himself to the station director in his best clothes and announcing grandly that he was the painter Monet and had decided to paint the station, an act of social confidence that secured him the access he needed. And that speaks to the increasing assurance with which he was moving through the world by this point in his career. The resulting paintings are among the most surprising and most formally adventurous of his middle period. Monet's decision to remain in Giverny during the German occupation of Normandy in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871, while most of his colleagues fled to England or elsewhere, was reversed when the advancing Prussian forces came too close, and he eventually made his way to London, where he spent several months and encountered the work of John Constable and J.M.W. Turner for the first time. Turner's paintings of light, atmosphere, and the dissolution of solid forms in mist and colour made a deep impression on Monet, and the English painter's willingness to push the representation of atmospheric effects to the point where subject matter almost disappeared into pure light and colour represented a precedent and a permission for directions that Monet was already beginning to explore in his own work. He later expressed some ambivalence about acknowledging Turner's influence, concerned perhaps that it might seem to diminish the originality of his own achievement. But the encounter was genuinely important, and its effects are traceable in the work he produced in the years that followed. The Poplar series, which Monet worked on in 1891, painting the row of poplar trees along the river Epte near Giverny that had been designated for felling by the local municipality, involved a characteristic piece of Monet practicality. He paid the timber merchant who had purchased the trees to delay cutting them until he had finished his painting campaign, effectively funding the preservation of his subject matter out of his own pocket. The series comprises approximately 24 canvases depicting the trees in different seasons and at different times of day, and the tall, vertical forms of the poplars and their reflections in the river below create compositions of extraordinary formal elegance that represent some of his most purely beautiful work. The trees were eventually felled after the series was completed, but the paintings remain as a record of a specific landscape feature that no longer exists, giving them an additional quality of elegy that was not part of Monet's original intention, but that has become inseparable from how the series is experienced. Monet's second son, Michel, born in 1878, just a year before Camille's death, was a quiet and somewhat withdrawn man who showed none of his father's artistic gifts, but who devoted his life to preserving the Giverny property and the collection of paintings that remained there, eventually bequeathing both to the Académie des Beaux-Arts in 1966, in the act of institutional generosity that secured the long-term preservation and public accessibility of both. Michel lived at Giverny for much of his life, maintaining the house and garden through the decades of neglect that followed his father's death and resisting the various pressures and opportunities to sell that presented themselves over the years. His death in a car accident in 1966, at the age of 87, brought the direct family line to an end and transferred the responsibility for the legacy to the institution that has since carried it forward through the restoration of the garden and the expansion of the Marmottan Museum's collection. The critical reassessment of Monet's late work, which began in the 1950s and accelerated dramatically through the 1960s, as the abstract expressionist movement in New York drew attention to the formal qualities of the large water lilies paintings, transformed the reception of his final years from a period of declining relevance into a proto-abstract achievement of extraordinary prescience. The American abstract expressionists, and the critics who wrote about them, saw in the late water lilies a precedent for their own investigations of color, scale, and the dissolution of representational content, a painter who had arrived at the edge of abstraction through the most sustained and patient investigation of natural appearances that any artist had ever undertaken. The reassessment gave Monet's late work a significance and a currency in the contemporary art world that it had not had during his lifetime, and it reframed the entire trajectory of his career in ways that continue to shape how his achievement is understood. Monet's painting style evolved continuously throughout his career in ways that reflected both the internal logic of his visual investigations and his responses to the changing world around him, and the distance between the relatively conventional landscape painting of his early Normandy work and the near-abstract immensity of the late water lilies is one of the most remarkable stylistic journeys undertaken by any artist. The history of Western painting. The evolution was not a series of sudden breaks or stylistic revolutions, but a gradual and organic development driven by the consistency of his central preoccupation, the investigation of light, as it falls on and transforms the surfaces of the world across an ever-widening range of subjects, scales, and conditions. Each series built on the discoveries of the previous one, and the late work can only be fully understood in the context of the 6 decades of looking and painting that preceded it. Monet's letters, of which several thousand survive and have been published in collected editions, provide an unusually detailed and emotionally direct record of his inner life, his working process, his relationships, and his responses to the world around him across more than 60 years of active correspondence. He wrote with great frequency to Alice during his painting campaigns away from Giverny, describing his daily working life, the subjects he was pursuing, his assessment of the paintings in progress, and the emotional states, the self-doubt, the occasional elation, the physical exhaustion that accompanied them, and these letters provide the most intimate and most reliable account available of what it actually felt like to be Monet in the process of making his work. The letters have been studied extensively by scholars and continue to be drawn on as primary evidence in virtually every serious account of his life and art. The Musée d'Orsay in Paris, which holds one of the most significant collections of Impressionist painting in the world, including major works by Monet spanning several decades of his career, was itself converted from a railway station, the Gare d'Orsay, built for the 1900 Paris Exposition, into a museum that opened in 1986, giving the building a connection to the industrial modernity that Impressionism had engaged with directly, and that Monet himself had painted in the Gare Saint-Lazare series nearly a century earlier. The collection includes works from across the full span of his career, from the early Norman landscapes and the salon submissions of the 1860s to the major series paintings of the 1880s and 90s, and it provides the most comprehensive single institution survey of his development available in any museum outside of the Marmottan. The experience of moving through the museum's vast converted interior with its high glass roof and its extraordinary concentration of Impressionist painting is one of the most distinctive museum experiences in the world. Monet's painting Autumn on the Seine, Argenteuil, completed in 1873, captures the particular quality of autumn light on the river with a combination of observed accuracy and painterly freedom that is characteristic of his most successful work from the Argenteuil period, the colors of the reflected. Trees in the water rendered with a looseness and a directness that suggests the shimmer and movement of the surface without imitating it literally. The painting demonstrates the central technical discovery of Impressionism at its most confident and most clearly expressed, that the way light behaves on a moving or reflective surface can be conveyed more accurately through the suggestion of its visual effect than through the precise rendering of its physical cause. The broken brushwork, the colors that approximate rather than describe, and the overall impression of a specific moment of light, captured and held, represent the core of what Monet had been working toward since Boudin first encouraged him to take his easel outdoors more than a decade earlier. Monet's painting Impression, Sunrise, which gave the Impressionist movement its name, and which is now one of the most historically significant paintings in the collection of the Musée Marmottan Monet in Paris. He was stolen from the museum in October 1985 in a brazen daylight robbery that also removed 4 other works from the collection and that represented one of the most significant art thefts in French history. The painting was recovered 5 years later, in 1990, along with the other stolen works, when French police tracked down the thieves through a network of intermediaries and recovered the paintings from a villa in the south of France where they had been stored in a concealed space behind a false wall. The recovery was a significant moment for the Marmottan and for French cultural institutions more broadly, and the painting was returned to the museum where it has remained under considerably enhanced security arrangements ever since. The water lilies that Monet cultivated in his Giverny pond, and that became the central subject of the most celebrated works of his career, were not native French plants, but exotic varieties imported from South America and Egypt, whose large floating leaves and spectacular flowers he found far more visually compelling than the smaller native water lilies available in French nurseries. He spent considerable time and effort developing the collection of aquatic plants in the pond, consulting with specialists, importing new varieties, and adjusting the planting over many years to achieve the particular balance of open water, floating leaves, and flowering plants that he wanted both for its visual beauty and for its painterly possibilities. The pond was maintained by a dedicated team of gardeners under his close personal direction, with one gardener assigned specifically to the care of the water garden and responsible for keeping the surface clean, the plants healthy, and the water at the level and clarity that Monet's painting required. Monet's painting technique evolved significantly between his early work and the late water lilies, moving from the relatively conventional broken brushwork of the Impressionist period toward an increasingly free and expressive application of paint that, in the largest of the late canvases, approaches a kind of gestural abstraction that bears comparison with painting made half a century later. In the Grande's decorations, the brushstrokes are large, sweeping, and applied with a physical freedom that suggests a painter working at the full extent of his reach across canvases that were too large to be seen in their entirety from the working distance at which they were painted. The loss of precise visual control that his failing eyesight imposed on the late work appears to have liberated rather than constrained his application of paint, producing surfaces of extraordinary energy and complexity that reveal new levels of detail and beauty as the viewer moves closer and then further from the canvas in the curved rooms of the orangery. The Norwegian painter Fritz Thorlo, whom Monet met in the late 1880s, and who introduced him to the possibility of painting in winter conditions, snow, ice, and the particular quality of cold grey light on frozen water, opened up a range of atmospheric effects that Monet had not previously explored, and that would become an important part of his repertoire in the series paintings of the following decades. The paintings Monet made of the frozen Seine at Bennecourt and Vertu in the winters of 1879 and 1880, produced in the immediate aftermath of Camille's death and during one of the coldest winters France had experienced in decades, are among the most emotionally affecting works of his early career. The frozen river, the bare trees, and the grey winter light creating an atmosphere of desolation and stillness that speaks both to the meteorological conditions he was recording and to the personal circumstances in which he was living. Monet's relationship with the American painter John Singer Sargent, who visited him at Giverny in the 1880s and who painted a celebrated portrait of Monet at work outdoors that is one of the most evocative images of plein-air painting ever made, was one of the warmer and more personally relaxed friendships of his middle years. Sargent admired Monet's work deeply and was influenced by it in ways that are visible in the looser, more atmospheric passages of his own painting, while Monet found in Sargent a level of technical accomplishment and genuine artistic seriousness that he respected, and that made the American a more interesting interlocutor than many of the painters who sought him out during the years of his growing celebrity. The two men painted together on several occasions, and the images that survive of them working side by side provide a rare picture of Monet in a condition of relaxed and productive companionship with another painter. The Grainstack series, which Monet began in earnest in 1890 after an initial exploration of the subject the previous year, was the first of his mature series to be fully conceived and executed as a series from the beginning, rather than evolving into one in the course of the work, and its commercial success at the Durand-Ruel exhibition in 1891 established the series format as the organizing principle of his mature practice. He worked on the haystacks across all seasons and in all weathers, sometimes working on 10 or more canvases simultaneously and moving between them as the light changed, and the resulting body of work demonstrates with particular clarity the central argument of the series' approach that the same subject seen under radically different conditions of light is not the same subject at all, but a series of entirely distinct visual experiences that share only their physical reference. The paintings were an immediate commercial success and were purchased by collectors in France, Germany, and the United States within weeks of the exhibition opening. Monet's painting of the Seine at Giverny in the early morning mist, produced during a campaign in 1897, in which he rose before dawn every day to paint the river in the particular atmospheric conditions of the early morning, represents one of his most sustained explorations of a specific and transient natural phenomenon, and one of his most formally radical bodies of work from the period between the Rouen Cathedral series and the Water Lily. The mornings on the Seine paintings, as they are known, show the river surface dissolving into a luminous silvery haze of reflected sky and overhanging trees, in which the distinction between solid and reflected form becomes almost impossible to maintain a dissolution of the boundary between the object and its image in water that anticipates the concerns of the water lilies by a decade, and that demonstrates how continuously and consistently Monet was pursuing the same set of visual and philosophical questions throughout the series of his mature career. The Durand-Ruel Gallery's exhibition of Impressionist paintings in New York in 1886, which included a significant number of works by Monet, played a crucial role in establishing the American market for Impressionist painting that would eventually make the United States one of the primary destinations for his work, and that would result in major holdings of his paintings in American institutions from the Art Institute of Chicago to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. American collectors were receptive to Impressionism at a moment when the French critical establishment was still deeply divided about its merits, and the combination of the work's visual accessibility, their relatively modest scale compared to the grand history paintings that dominated European academic art, and the enthusiasm of dealers like Durand-Ruel and later others who followed his lead into the American market, created conditions in which Monet's paintings found buyers with a speed and consistency that his French market had taken much longer to develop. Monet's painting of the Houses of Parliament in London, produced during his visits to the city between 1899 and 1901, and continued in his Giverny studio for several years afterward, exists in approximately 19 versions that explore the building's relationship to the Thames fog in different conditions of light and atmosphere, from pale lavender morning mist to deep orange and purple evening light. The buildings themselves are barely visible in many of the paintings, reduced to dark silhouettes emerging from and dissolving back into the luminous atmospheric haze that was Monet's real subject, and the series represents the furthest point in his career toward the dissolution of solid form in light and atmosphere that the late water lilies would continue and deepen. The Houses of Parliament paintings were exhibited at the Durand-Ruel Gallery in Paris in 1904, alongside the London Bridge and Waterloo Bridge series, in an exhibition that was one of the most enthusiastically received of his career. Monet's stepson, Jean-Pierre Hochetet, Alice's youngest child from her first marriage, left a memoir of life at Giverny that provides one of the most intimate and most practically detailed accounts of what it was actually like to live in the household of one of the most celebrated artists of the age. The daily rhythms, the meals, the gardening, the painting campaigns, and the particular atmosphere of a house organized around the needs and the temperament of a man who was simultaneously a demanding and devoted presence in the lives of those around him. The memoir describes a household that was warm and sociable, but that operated according to routines established by Monet's working, needs meals at specific times, a morning walk to assess the garden, the afternoon devoted to work in the studio or outdoors, and it gives a picture of a man whose artistic seriousness coexisted with a genuine capacity for enjoyment of food, company, and the daily pleasures of the garden that the more purely biographical accounts of his work and his struggles tend not to fully convey. The chromatic range of Monet's painting expanded dramatically over the course of his career, moving from the relatively limited palette of earth tones and conventional landscape colors of his early work toward an increasingly pure and saturated use of the spectrum, that by the time of the water lilies had become one of the most distinctive and immediately recognizable features of his style. The expansion of the palette was driven partly by the increasing availability during the second half of the 19th century of new synthetic pigments that offered colors of greater purity and permanence than the traditional pigments they supplemented, and partly by Monet's own developing understanding of the relationship between color and light, the insight that the shadows in a sunlit landscape are not grey or brown, but full of color, that the sky reflects into every surface it touches, and that the conventional representation of the natural world in terms of local color was a fundamental misrepresentation of how the world actually appeared in strong light. Monet's painting Bathers at La Grenouillère, completed in 1869 alongside a very similar painting of the same subject by Renoir, who was working beside him, is one of the earliest and most clearly realized examples of the Impressionist approach to painting a riverside bathing spot near Bougival, depicted with broken brushwork, unblended colors, and an atmosphere of casual outdoor pleasure that represented a new way of engaging with the visual experience of contemporary life. The two paintings Monet and Renoir made of the same scene on the same day demonstrate both the shared sensibility of the two painters at this moment in their development and the individual differences in emphasis that distinguished them. Monet more interested in the quality of light on the water, Renoir more attentive to the social life of the figures on the floating platform. The paintings are now considered foundational documents of the Impressionist movement and are frequently exhibited together as evidence of the collaborative, creative environment in which the style first crystallized. Monet's garden at Giverny was planted and maintained according to a philosophy of color sequencing that reflected his understanding of how colors interact with each other in natural light, and that gave the garden at any given time, year, a quality of visual coherence and intensity that visitors consistently described as overwhelming in its beauty. He planned the planting so that specific color combinations would be visible from specific viewpoints at specific times of year, treating the garden as a three-dimensional painting that changed continuously through the seasons, and that required the same kind of sustained planning and revision that he brought to his work on canvas. He consulted with horticulturalists, ordered plants from specialist nurseries across France and abroad, and supervised the planting himself with a level of personal involvement that his head gardener Félix Breuil described as total no decision about what went where was made without Monet's direct approval. The Orangerie Museum in Paris, which houses the Grandes decorations in the two oval rooms that Monet designed in collaboration with the architect Camille Lefebvre. He was renovated between 2006 and 2006 to restore the natural light conditions that Monet had specified for the installation and that had been compromised by modifications made to the building in the 1960s. The renovation removed a false ceiling installed during the earlier modification and restored the original skylights through which natural light was intended to enter the rooms, recreating the conditions under which Monet had envisioned the paintings being seen, the light shifting through the day and the seasons, the paintings never looking quite the same twice, the experience of being in the rooms changing continuously in response to the same atmospheric variables that had been Monet's subject throughout his career. The restored Orangerie is now considered one of the great museum experiences in the world. Monet's friendship with the poet Stéphane Mallarmé, whose symbolist poetry was concerned with many of the same questions of sensory perception, the relationship between appearance and reality, and the limits of representation that Monet was pursuing in paint, reflected the degree to which his work was engaged with the broader intellectual and aesthetic concerns of his time, rather than simply with the technical problems of painting light outdoors. Mallarmé and Monet met regularly at the weekly gatherings that Mallarmé hosted at his Paris apartment, where artists, writers, and thinkers from across the Parisian avant-garde came together to discuss ideas and the conversations between them about the nature of perception, the relationship between a subject and its representation, and the possibility of an art that captured experience rather than depicting objects, contributed to the intellectual framework within which Monet understood and articulated his own practice. Monet's painting of his garden at Giverny began in earnest in the 1890s and continued until the end of his working life, producing a body of work that encompasses not only the celebrated water lilies, but a wide range of paintings depicting the flower garden, the Japanese bridge, the wisteria, the rose arches, and the particular quality of light in the garden at different times of day and in different seasons. The garden paintings as a whole represent one of the most sustained engagements between an artist and a specific place in the history of Western art, a relationship that lasted more than 40 years and that produced a body of work, so extensive and so varied that its full scope is rarely encountered in any single exhibition or collection. The garden was simultaneously the subject of the work, the studio in which much of it was produced, and the most elaborate three-dimensional expression of the visual intelligence that also produced the paintings, and the relationship between the two is one of the most extraordinary examples of a creative vision finding its perfect and final form. The series of paintings Monet made of the Japanese bridge at Giverny in the years immediately following his cataract surgery in 1923, during which his vision was still adapting to the post-surgical lenses, show the bridge almost disappearing into a swirling mass of color and gestural brushwork that is so far removed from the relatively precise depictions of the same subject made in the 1890s that they might almost be by a different painter. The late bridge paintings have been interpreted as evidence of the perceptual distortions caused by his compromised vision, but they can equally be understood as the logical conclusion of a process of formal liberation that had been underway throughout the late period, a painter finally arriving at a point where the subject is simply the occasion for an investigation of color and paint that has become entirely self-sufficient and that requires no external referent to justify its existence. Whether driven by necessity or by choice, the late bridge paintings represent some of the most radical work of his entire career. Monet's reputation during the final decades of his life was so firmly established that he had become a cultural institution in his own right, visited by artists, collectors, politicians, and dignitaries from across the world, who made the pilgrimage to Giverny to see the garden and the painter at work in a manner that reflected a level of celebrity that very few artists in any era have achieved during their own lifetimes. He received these visitors with a mixture of genuine hospitality and carefully managed privacy, welcoming those whose company he valued and who had legitimate artistic or personal reasons for visiting while protecting his working. Time and his creative solitude from the intrusions that celebrity tends to generate. The garden itself became a destination for artists from across Europe and America who came to paint it, creating a small community of painters in and around Giverny during the summer months, whose presence Monet tolerated without particular enthusiasm, but that reflected the degree to which his garden had become a significant location in the farce, artistic geography of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Monet's painting The Artist's Garden at Vétheuil, completed in 1881 during the period he spent in the small Seine Valley village after leaving Argenteuil, shows the path through a sunlit garden lined with tall hollyhocks and flowering plants leading toward the river and the village beyond, in a composition that anticipates the later Giverny garden paintings in its treatment of the garden as a passage through color rather than a space to be depicted from outside. The painting was made during one of the most personally difficult periods of his life. Camille had died 2 years earlier. He was living with Alice and the combined family of 8 children in cramped rented accommodation, and his financial situation remained precarious. But it has a quality of sunlit pleasure and visual abundance that suggests a painter finding in the act of looking at the natural world a form of consolation that the circumstances of his personal life could not otherwise provide. Monet's physical health during the final decade of his life was managed largely by his stepdaughter Blanche Hochetet, Monet, Alice's daughter from her first marriage, and Jean Monet's widow, who moved back to Giverny after Jean's death in 1914 to care for her stepfather, and who remained there until his death, providing the practical support and personal devotion that allowed him to continue working through the years of declining health and failing eyesight that preceded his death in 1926. Blanche was herself a painter of considerable ability, whose own career was largely subordinated to the demands of caring for Monet during these final years, and the sacrifice she made in doing so is one of the less celebrated but genuinely significant aspects of the story of the late work. Without her presence and her management of the household and its complicated logistics, the completion of the Grandes decorations already jeopardized by the deaths of Alice and Jean and by Monet's own health problems might well not have been achieved. Monet's painting of the water garden in the early morning, when the surface of the pond reflected the sky above and the surrounding trees with a stillness and clarity that the afternoon breeze would later disturb, was a subject he returned to across the full span of his Water Lilies campaign, finding in the particular quality of early morning light on still water a visual experience of extraordinary richness that sustained his attention across more than 2 decades of sustained investigation. The early morning paintings have a quality of hushed luminosity, the colors pale and silvery, the reflections precise but somehow insubstantial, the surface of the water suggesting both depth and transparency simultaneously, that is different from the richer, more saturated colour of the paintings made later in the day, and the comparison between them demonstrates with particular clarity the central insight of the series' approach, that the same subject at different times is not the same subject at all, but an entirely distinct visual experience that deserves its own canvas and its own sustained attention. Monet's painting of the lily pond at Giverny, without the Japanese bridge, simply the surface of the water, the floating leaves, the reflections of the sky and the overhanging willows, with no horizon line and no fixed point of reference, to anchor the viewer in conventional pictorial space, represented a radical departure from the traditions of landscape painting that had governed Western art for centuries, and that required the presence of a horizon, a foreground, and a clear spatial recession to orient the viewer within the depicted scene. By removing the horizon and filling the entire canvas with the surface of the water, Monet created a pictorial space that had no clear top or bottom, no near or far, no fixed relationship between the viewer and the depicted world, a space that surrounded, rather than faced, the viewer and that anticipated by decades the environmental and immersive installations that would become a significant strand of contemporary art in the second half of the 20th century. The decision was not arrived at suddenly, but developed gradually through the series, and its full implications were only apparent when the largest of the canvases were finally installed in the oval rooms of the Orangerie. The correspondence between Monet and the critic and writer Octave Mirbeau, who was one of the most enthusiastic and most articulate advocates for his work during the critical years of the 1880s and 1890s, when Impressionism was still fighting for serious recognition, provides a detailed and often moving record of the relationship between an artist and a critic whose support was genuinely consequential for the development of his reputation. Mirbeau wrote about Monet's work with a depth of engagement and a quality of descriptive precision that went far beyond the conventional critical appreciation of the period, and his essays and reviews contributed significantly to the intellectual framework within which educated audiences learned to understand and value what Impressionism was doing. His friendship with Monet was warm and sustained, and the letters between them reveal the degree to which the critical reception of his work mattered to Monet, despite the public posture of indifference to critical opinion that he sometimes maintained. Monet's painting The Magpie, completed in 1868 and 9, and now considered one of the finest snow paintings in the history of Western art, shows a single black and white bird perched on a gate in a snow-covered Norman landscape, the winter light creating shadows of pale blue and lavender across the snow that the academic tradition would have painted grey or white, but that Monet rendered with a chromatic sensitivity that was entirely his own. The painting was rejected by the Salon jury in 1869, which found its colour too unconventional and its apparent simplicity insufficiently ambitious for official exhibition, but it is now recognised as a landmark in the development of Impressionism's approach to colour in shadow, the understanding that shadows are not absences of colour, but presences of colour, determined by the quality of the light falling on the surface and reflecting into it from the sky and the surrounding landscape. The blue shadows on snow that the painting demonstrates so clearly would become one of the most immediately recognizable signatures of the Impressionist approach to outdoor painting. The degree to which Monet's Giverny garden has become one of the most visited and most photographed sites in France reflects a cultural phenomenon that goes well beyond the normal relationship between an artist's home and his or her public legacy, and that raises genuine questions about the nature of the relationship between the garden as Monet created it and the garden as it now exists as a restored and managed cultural destination. The garden that visitors experience today is carefully maintained to reproduce the visual effect that Monet designed, but it is necessarily a reproduction rather than the original. The plants have been replaced multiple times since his death. The precise arrangements have been reconstructed from historical evidence rather than continuous cultivation, and the presence of hundreds of thousands of visitors each year inevitably affects the atmosphere of a space that Monet designed for solitary contemplation and sustained looking. The gap between the garden as a creative environment and the garden as a tourist destination is one that the curators who manage it are fully aware of and that they navigate with considerable care and intelligence. Monet's painting of the Véthus church across the Seine, produced during his time in the village in the late 1870s and early 1880s, represents one of the most sustained engagements with a single architectural subject in his pre-series work, and anticipates, in some respects, the more systematic investigation of the Rouen Cathedral series a decade later. The village of Véthus, with its medieval church reflected in the wide, slow river, provided a subject of considerable visual richness that Monet painted in different seasons and at different times of day, with a sensitivity and variety that give the group of paintings a coherence and a cumulative effect that prefigures the serial thinking of the mature work. The paintings were made during the most personally difficult period of his life: the death of Camille, the financial pressures, the complicated domestic situation, and their quality of concentrated visual attention to the beauty of a specific place carries a quality of refuge that the biographical circumstances make particularly moving. The technical challenge of painting water, its movement, its reflections, its transparency, and its capacity to hold and dissolve the colors of everything that surrounds it, was one that Monet engaged with more persistently and more inventively than any other painter in the history of Western art. And the body of work he produced in pursuit of this challenge represents a contribution to the painting of water that has no real parallel or precedent. From the early paintings of the Seine at Argenteuil and the harbour at Le Havre, to the late water lilies, in which water has become the entire world of the painting, his engagement with water as a subject spans more than 6 decades and encompasses an extraordinary range of conditions, scales, and atmospheric effects. The consistency of the preoccupation across such a long career and such a wide range of contexts is one of the most remarkable facts of his artistic life, and the body of work it produced is one of the most concentrated and sustained investigations of a single visual phenomenon in the history of painting. Monet's relationship with food was enthusiastic and practically expressed, and the kitchen at Giverny, painted in yellow and blue tiles and equipped with the full range of equipment needed for the serious cooking that he and Alice both cared about, was one of the rooms of the house that he paid closest personal attention to, and that reflected his genuine pleasure in the daily rituals of eating and hospitality that organized the domestic life of the household. He kept a notebook of recipes that he collected over the years from friends, restaurants, and his own experimentation, and the meals served at Giverny to the family and their frequent guests were taken seriously as an expression of the same attention to sensory experience that his painting reflected. Several accounts by visitors to Giverny during his lifetime mention the quality and abundance of the food as one of the memorable aspects of the experience, suggesting a household in which the pleasures of the table were understood as complementary rather than incidental to the pleasures of art. The Impressionist group's decision to hold 8 independent exhibitions between 1874 and 1886, outside the official salon system and without a jury to determine what could or could not be shown, represented one of the most significant institutional innovations in the history of modern art, and one that established a model of independent exhibition that has been followed by avant-garde artists and groups ever since. Monet participated in 5 of the 8 exhibitions, missing the others for various reasons, including disagreements about who else should be allowed to show, and his contributions to the group shows were consistently among the most discussed and most noticed works on display. The exhibitions gave the Impressionist group a collective identity and a public presence that individual submissions to the Salon could not have provided, and they created the conditions for the critical debate about Impressionism that eventually, over the course of the 1880s, shifted from predominantly hostile to predominantly positive. Monet's painting Autumn Effect at Argenteuil, completed in 1873, captures the particular quality of a calm autumn day on the Seine, with a precision and a beauty that makes it one of the most immediately appealing works of his Argenteuil period, the warm oranges and yellows of the autumn trees. Reflected in the still water of the river, the pale blue sky, and the quality of late afternoon light that seems to hold the entire scene in a moment of absolute stillness before the season moves on. The painting demonstrates the central achievement of the Impressionist approach at its most confident and most fully realized, the use of broken color and visible brushwork, not as a departure from the accurate representation of the natural world, but as the most effective means of conveying the actual visual experience of being in a specific place at a specific moment, with all the atmospheric richness and sensory immediacy that the academic approach, for all its technical accomplishment, could not provide. The question of Monet's influence on subsequent painting is one that is both easy and difficult to answer. Easy because the traces of his work are visible everywhere in the painting of the 20th century and beyond, and difficult because the influence has been so pervasive and so thoroughly absorbed that it has become part of the general visual language of modern painting, rather than a set of specific debts that can be identified and attributed. The abstract expressionists' acknowledgement of the water lilies as a precedent for their own investigations of scale, color, and the immersive pictorial environment is perhaps the most clearly articulated line of influence, but the broader effect of his demonstration that painting could be organized around the investigation of light and atmospheric effect, rather than the depiction of objects and narratives, has shaped the development of painting across a much wider range of movements and individual artists than any single line of influence can capture. Monet's painting Irises by the Pond, completed in 1914 and 15 as part of the sustained engagement with the Giverny garden that characterized the final decades of his working life, shows the purple and white flowers of the iris beds reflected in the surface of the water garden pond, with a combination of observed accuracy and painterly freedom that is characteristic of his most successful late work. The painting was made at a moment when his eyesight was already beginning its serious decline, and when the physical effort of working on large canvases outdoors was becoming increasingly demanding, and it represents one of the last works in which the relationship between the observed garden and the painted surface retains the relatively close correspondence that characterized his work before the cataracts became severe. The irises that appear in this and several related paintings were among his favorite flowers and among the plants in the garden, to whose cultivation he devoted the most personal attention and care. The critical hostility that Impressionism initially attracted was not simply a matter of conservative taste or institutional defensiveness, but reflected a genuine philosophical disagreement about the purpose and proper subject matter, serious art that was being played out in the reviews and the salon jury decisions of the 1860s and 1870s. The academic tradition held that painting's highest ambition was the depiction of morally and historically significant subjects treated with technical accomplishment and compositional grandeur that the value of a painting was inseparable from the importance of what it depicted. Monet's insistence that a haystack or a river or a garden in afternoon light was a sufficient subject for a painting of the greatest seriousness was not simply a formal preference, but a challenge to this entire hierarchy of values, and the eventual triumph of Impressionism represented not just a change in taste, but a fundamental shift in what art was understood to be for and what it was understood to be capable of. Monet's large decorative panels depicting wisteria, produced in the early 1920s as part of the extended campaign of the Grandes decorations, show the hanging clusters of pale purple flowers reflected in the pond surface in paintings of extraordinary delicacy and atmospheric beauty that represent some of the most purely lyrical work of his entire career. The wisteria panels were intended as part of the orangerie installation, but were ultimately not included in the final configuration of the rooms, and they are now held in various collections where they are occasionally exhibited together in a grouping that approximates the decorative ensemble Monet had envisioned. The paintings have a quality of suspended time and sensory richness that makes them among the most immediately pleasurable works of his late period, and their relative obscurity compared to the Water Lily series means that encounters with them in museum collections tend to have a quality of unexpected discovery that the more famous works, however magnificent, can no longer provide. The experience of standing in the oval rooms of the Orangerie in Paris, surrounded on all sides by the Grandes decorations, is one of the most distinctive and most discussed museum experiences in the world. A total immersion in painted light and colour that Monet designed specifically to create a sensation of being inside rather than in front of a landscape, of being surrounded by water and sky and floating plants rather than looking at a representation of them. The rooms are entered through a narrow doorway that transitions abruptly from the conventional white walls of the museum's other galleries into the oval space where the paintings begin immediately and extend without interruption around the entire circumference of the room, and the effect of this transition from the white wall to the painted world is one that visitors consistently describe as surprising and quietly overwhelming, a shift in the quality of experience that the intellectual preparation provided by photographs and reproductions cannot adequately convey. Monet's painting of the rose arches in the Giverny garden, produced in the early 19-teens, shows the central path through the flower garden, covered by the climbing roses that he had trained over a series of metal arches to create a tunnel of flowers and light that was one of the most dramatic features of the garden's design, and one of the most visually extraordinary spaces in any artist's garden anywhere in the world. The paintings of the rose arches have a quality of complete sensory immersion, the path disappearing into the tunnel of flowers, the light filtering through the petals and leaves above, the colors of the roses and the sky beyond the end of the arch, creating a visual experience of unusual richness and intimacy that anticipates the spatial thinking of the Orangerie installation, and that demonstrates how consistently Monet was moving throughout the late period toward an art that surrounded and enclosed the viewer rather than presenting itself as an object to be observed from outside. Monet's second marriage to Alice Hoskday in 1901, which formalized a domestic partnership that had been in existence for more than 2 decades, was a quiet civil ceremony that attracted no particular public attention, and that Monet himself described in his letters as simply the regularization of a situation that had long been the practical reality of their lives. The marriage reflected the degree to which the complicated domestic arrangements that had begun with Ernest Hochday's bankruptcy and Alice's gradual transition from patron's wife to Monet's companion had resolved themselves, over many years, into a relationship of genuine depth and mutual dependence that both participants found impossible to imagine living without. Alice's organizational intelligence, her management of the household and the family, and her emotional support during the periods of self-doubt and physical difficulty that accompanied Monet's painting campaigns were as essential to the production of his work as the painting itself, and her death in 1911 left a gap in his life that no subsequent arrangement could fill. The collection of Monet's paintings held by the Art Institute of Chicago, which includes major works from across the full span of his career, and represents one of the finest holdings of his work outside of France, reflects the enthusiasm with which American collectors and institutions embraced Impressionism from the 1880s onward, and the sustained commitment to acquiring and preserving major examples that has given American museums collections of French 19th century painting that rival those of the French national institutions. The Art Institute's collection includes multiple versions of the Haystack series, several of the Rouen Cathedral paintings, and a significant group of the Giverny garden works, and the experience of moving through these holdings in the museum's galleries provides one of the most comprehensive surveys of his development available in any single institution outside Paris. The breadth and quality of the collection reflect both the taste of the individual collectors who originally purchased the works and the institutional commitment to their preservation and display that has made the Art Institute one of the world's great repositories of Impressionist painting. Monet's garden at Giverny attracted a small colony of painters during the 1880s and 1890s who came to the village specifically because of his presence there, and who settled in the surrounding area, painting the local landscape and socializing in a community that revolved around his example without ever quite gaining his active participation or encouragement. The American painters, Theodore Robinson, John Leslie Breck, and Lilla Cabot Perry, were among the most significant figures in this informal colony, and their work shows the direct influence of Monet's approach to color and light in ways that reflect both the value of proximity to a working master and the inevitable limitations of an influence absorbed from outside rather than developed from within. Perry, in particular, maintained a long friendship with Monet and wrote about her conversations with him in an account that provides one of the most direct and practically useful records of his ideas about painting and his approach to specific technical problems that any contemporary source has preserved. The decision by the French state to accept Monet's donation of the Grandes decorations and to create the Orangerie installation specifically to house them was not without its bureaucratic difficulties and delays, and the negotiations between Monet, Clemenceau, and the relevant government ministries extended over several years, during which the project was at various points threatened by changes in government, disagreements about the terms of the donation, and Monet's own periodic withdrawals from the agreement when aspects of the installation did not meet his specification. The final agreement was signed in 1924, 2 years before Monet's death, and the installation was completed and opened to the public in May 1927, 5 months after he died, close enough to the completion of the project that he was able to follow its progress through the final stages and to have a reasonably clear sense of what the finished rooms would look like, but too late for him to see the installation in its intended form with his own eyes. Monet's painting of the water garden in autumn, when the leaves of the surrounding trees turned yellow and orange and fell onto the surface of the pond among the dying water lily leaves, created a subject of extraordinary chromatic richness that he explored in several canvases that are less well known than the spring and summer lily paintings, but that demonstrate the full range of his engagement with the seasonal transformation of the garden he had created. The autumn pond paintings have a quality of melancholy beauty that is inseparable from the seasonal associations of the subject, the falling leaves, the dying flowers, the colors of decay, but that Monet rendered not with sadness, but with the same quality of joyful and sustained attention that he brought to the full flower of the garden in spring and summer. The acceptance of transience as a condition of beauty rather than its negation was one of the deepest convictions of his artistic life, and one that the autumn paintings express with particular directness and clarity. Monet's legacy in the 21st century extends far beyond the specific influence of his technique or his subject matter to encompass a broader set of values about the relationship between art and the natural world, the importance of sustained attention to a single subject across time, and the possibility of finding in the most ordinary and most domestic elements of daily life a garden, a pond, the quality of morning light on still water subjects of inexhaustible beauty and meaning. These values, which he pursued with extraordinary consistency across more than 6 decades of working life, and which he embodied as completely and as convincingly as any artist in history, continue to speak to people across the world with an immediacy and a directness that the passage of time has not diminished. His painting remains among the most loved in the world, not because of its art historical significance or its critical reputation, but because of the quality of attentiveness and delight in the visible world that it communicates so directly. To anyone who spends time with it, you can let all of that go now. There is nothing left to hold on to or remember. Somewhere tonight, the pond at Giverny is still and dark, and the water lilies are resting on the surface, and the willows are quiet at the edge of the water, and the night is deep and full of rest,